Thanks for listening to Poured Over, the Barnes & Noble podcast. My name is Chris Gillespie. My guest today is a Pulitzer Prize and National Book Award-winning author whose works include critically acclaimed biographies of such figures as George Washington, Ulysses S. Grant, and Alexander Hamilton. He is back this May with a brand new biography about Mark Twain. Please join me in welcoming to the show, Ron Chernow. Ron, thanks so much for being here.
It's really such a pleasure to be here with you, Chris. Thank you.
I'm really excited to get to speak with you today. As you can see, I have my advanced copy of the Mark Twain biography right here that I've been reading and enjoying. It's such a beautifully written and detailed account of Twain's life that really leaves no stone unturned and really brings readers into Twain's life and times. And I know that achieving that level of prose, especially with nonfiction, takes a tremendous amount of research and effort. I'm curious to hear, how long did this biography take you to write? Like, when did you first decide that you were going to write about Mark Twain as your next subject?
I started writing this, Chris, about 5 or 6 years ago. This is a gigantic life to write about. It was a life of tremendous literary triumph. It was a life of tremendous personal calamity. I think that Mark Twain created in himself a personality arguably greater than any of his creations. I think that his life was arguably more dramatic than any novel he ever created. And there were just so many sides and dimensions to his life. To give you some idea of just how much work goes into creating a biography like this, I tend to record all the information on 4x6 index cards. And by the time that I sat down to write after 4 or 5 years, I had accumulated 25,000 index cards that I then arranged in these different boxes. I really had ideal materials. People tend to associate Mark Twain with Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Life in the Mississippi, but he wrote 24 books, between 1,000 and 2,000 magazine articles, thousands of interviews and lectures. I had access to 12,000 letters written by Mark Twain and his family, 19,000 letters written to them, on and on, 50 notebooks jammed with entries. And so it really permitted me to recreate in very fine detail both his outer life and his inner life at the same time.
Yeah, and like I said, it is so comprehensive. And to your point, there could be books written about, and I'm sure there are, just specific parts of Mark Twain's life, whether it's his writing career or his personal life, but you do a deep dive into all aspects of his very dramatic and theatrically interesting life. That makes for a really exciting read. And before we get too far into the conversation, I have a minor clerical question that I'm realizing is also kind of a larger philosophical question. But in your mind, is there a difference between Samuel Clemens and Mark Twain?
Well, Samuel Clemens gradually becomes Mark Twain. I mean, he was working out in the Nevada territory as a miner, and then he started contributing articles to a newspaper called the Territorial Enterprise. And he assumed the Mark Twain pseudonym, which actually means 2 fathoms or 12 feet deep. This was he had been a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi, and that's where he got that term. And over the years, he really grows into this Mark Twain persona that he presents to the public. One of the things that I found very interesting was, as the years went on, he would sign letters, Mark. To his wife, it was Samuel. But very often to friends, he would sign the letter Mark. Very often, friends addressed him as Mark. And so he invented this personality. And over the course of the years, he assumed the trappings of that personality. But of course, I was always trying to get to the hidden man, the secretive man, because Americans have this image of Mark Twain as a man standing up there in a white suit with a cigar, and a mustache. And he's very charming, and he's dispensing these witticisms. What I found was that this was an extremely complicated man. Beneath all the charm and irreverence and merriment, there was a lot of melancholy, there was anger, there was depression. He was a man of very strong opinions. He was extraordinarily smart, very wide-ranging in his interests. In fact, I found it very interesting that he very seldom read novels. He said that the only time he would read novels is when all of his neighbors were talking about a new novel, and he felt under pressure to have an opinion about this. And so he was a difficult person to capture in all of his many moods and dimensions.
5 or 6 years ago, when you first set out on this journey, were you embarking on this journey assuming that with that image of Mark Twain in the white suit with the mustache and the cigar on stage in mind, and then we're gradually surprised by the depth that you found? Like, what inspired you in the first place to begin that journey with Mark Twain?
Well, I was first attracted to Mark Twain, interestingly enough, not as Mark Twain as a novelist or a short story writer, but really as a platform artist and an all-purpose political pundit. Back when I was 25 years old, I was living in Philadelphia. I was a freelance magazine writer. And one night I saw a poster up that the actor Hal Holbrook was doing a one-man show called Mark Twain Tonight. He would stand up there in the white suit with the cigar. And I was really struck by the freshness and the cynicism of all of the political humor. I could still remember lines that I first heard that night, Mark Twain saying, there's no Native American criminal class except the Congress. Or he said, suppose you were an idiot and suppose you were a congressman, but oh, I repeat myself. Another one that I loved, he said, I say, and I say it with pride, that we have legislatures that bring higher prices than any others in the world. And so it was as much Mark Twain, the platform artist, Mark Twain, the personality and pundit, who captured my attention. And, most biographies of Mark Twain, there have been a lot of books written about him. Usually by the time you get up to Tom Sawyer or Huck Finn, you're half or two-thirds of the way, through the book. Whereas in many ways, I was even more interested, if anything, in the later years where he's functioning essentially as the conscience of American society. He becomes outspoken on a wide range of controversial political issues. So, when I tell Chris, when I first told people that I was doing Mark Twain, they all said to me, oh, this is such a big departure for you, because I had done, with the Morgans, the Warburgs, the Rockefellers, I had done financiers and industrialists. With Hamilton and Washington, I had done founding fathers, and I did Grant and another president and another general. And people said, this is really kind of far afield. And I said, well, I think actually as you're reading the book, it won't seem quite as different from my other books, simply because I go into great detail about his, political activities, and also in great detail into his business life, these madcap business adventures. And he loses one fortune after another. At one point in the book, I say that I had difficulty telling whether Mark Twain was a writer with business as a sideline, whether he was a businessman, with literature as a sideline. And he himself said the business, particularly the business failures, became very distracting. He writes a letter to his family. He said, life has become badgering, harassing. He was just walking around depressed all the time because he was losing so much money in his business. And, the tragedy of his life, he made a fortune in book royalties. He made a fortune on the lecture platform. He married an heiress. He could have had a nice, easy life. He had a 25-room mansion up in Hartford and 3 beautiful daughters. He could have, and for a long time, did have a nice life. But he not only squanders his fortune, he squanders his wife's fortune. Then they're forced into exile for 9 years. He's forced to do an around the world lecture tour to pay off his debt. So that there are an enormous number of self-inflicted wounds because of this speculative instinct. He said once, I have to speculate, such being my nature. And he was so often wrong in business. There was a funny line in the Washington Post that said, if you want to avoid losing money, stay away from any company where you hear Mark Twain got in on the ground floor, because that was invariably a sign that it was a bad investment. There was some truth to that.
I think it's interesting to get to the roots of that, because you do establish early on in the book, when you're talking about Mark Twain's childhood and the family that he came into, his father also kind of had a similar thought process in terms of investing in these kind of wild schemes that were not necessarily get rich quick schemes, but it seems like he kind of inherited that trait from his father, or maybe it was growing up not with a ton of privilege or money kind of inspired him to constantly be chasing it. Did you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that you kind of put your finger on the psychological root of what I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm.
His father died when Sam was only 11 years old, and his father failed in 5 separate businesses. So his father was a very downcast and withdrawn personality. But I think that what can happen, when you have that early exposure to poverty, the fear of that stays with you. Even in later years, when he was very rich and famous, he said that not a month went by that he didn't have a dream that he was poor again and he had to go back to the river to make a living. So on some level, no matter how much money he had, and he won and lost many fortunes, on some level, he was always running scared inside when it came to money, and was very, very preoccupied. One of the Mark Twain biographers said that there's probably never been an American author who has been so obsessed with the lure and chink and rustle of money as Mark Twain, and it really is true. And because in his fiction, he so often satirizes these money-mad characters, somehow if you don't know anything about his life, you figure that he himself, would never have succumbed in that way. But in many ways, he was writing his autobiography. There are all these characters in his books with these get-rich-quick schemes and kind of blue sky rhetoric. And he had a lot of that in his nature, which is why he saw it in other people.
I think also when you're kind of talking about how in the book, Mark Twain had this experience with his father, with the poverty and all of this. And I think you said something along the lines that this is sort of quintessentially American to you, about like this idea of kind of this capitalist dream or kind of the American dream. And that kind of is just infused with Mark Twain, who he is as a person. I was wondering if you could speak more about that, kind of like how that struggle is American.
This won't become as a surprise to any of your viewers. I mean, we live in a society that is very obsessed with money and very obsessed with status, and this is the way that people are judged. And I say in the book that he experienced something that I think has a particularly traumatic effect if it happens in childhood, which is downward mobility. And psychologists have commented that loss of status, once you've had any kind of status, then to lose it, to be on that kind of downhill slide is a very, very terrifying experience. And even though he marries this, heiress Livy, wonderful wife who'd inherited this fortune, coal, timber, railroads, and they're inhabiting this gigantic mansion up in Hartford, he never can shake the memory of that early childhood experience, because his father had failed in business so many times, of everything you have suddenly slipping through your fingers. And he's always afraid that it's going to happen again. So there's an enormous amount of insecurity around the topic of money. And he would work up these incredible fantasies about the commercial worth of things that he, invested in, without really adequately seeing the risks or the downsides to things. I mean, for instance, his main investment was in something called a Page compositor, this typesetter that was supposed to replace, each one's supposed to replace 5 or 6 printers, at a newspaper. And you can see in his notebook, he's adding up the number of newspapers in the entire world, because he's assuming that every newspaper is going to buy or read the Page typesetter. Similarly, there's a period where he had his own publishing company called Charles Webster and Company, and he decides to do a biography of Pope Leo XIII, and he's counting up the number of Catholics in the world, convinced that every Catholic is going to rush out. There was no B&N at that time, but kind of rush out to the local bookstore and buy a copy of the Pope's biography, which of course did not happen.
I think it's also funny because I think it was maybe just last night that I was reading that despite Mark Twain having these tendencies himself, I was laughing because the passage that I was reading was him basically criticizing his older brother, who he kind of had a fraught relationship with, who his older brother also had these schemes and was doing it and was going personally bankrupt. And Mark Twain's like, come on, what's this guy's problem? He just can't get it together. Like, I think one of the brothers' ideas, Orion's ideas, was a like paddle boat that could cross the Atlantic Ocean in a day or something like that.
Cross, the Atlantic in a few days. And Mark Twain would mock him. And Orion was really kind of head in the clouds kind of guy. Imagine being Mark Twain's brother. Gee, in any kind of sibling rivalry, your brother just happens to be like the most famous American in the world. Could not have been easy. But Mark Twain himself was always coming up with inventions. He had one that was actually lucrative and successful. It was called the Mark Twain self-pasting scrapbook, because he was always keeping scrapbooks and would be sitting there, with the glue pot and the brushes. And we know what happens then. So he came up with this idea that there would already be adhesive materials, in the self-pasting scrapbook. So you would just kind of have to put the newspaper clipping, on it, and it would say. And actually, he sold 100,000 of those. That was his, big commercial success. But almost everything else was a failure. And he had all sorts of ideas. He had an idea for a clamp so that babies could not throw off their bedclothes. He invested in an idea to desalinate water. He invested also in a shirt that had pre-attached collars and cuffs. Shirts did not have that at that time. You would, add them separately. Some of the ideas that he had were really quite visionary. He had an idea that anticipated microfilm or microfiche, that you would take an extremely large map and reduce it to the size of fly speck, but then you would examine it through the microscope, which is really kind of microfilm or microfilm. He had this idea of portraits and pictures being transported by light, which I guess would be the essence of, I think, fiber optics or something like that. So he had these wonderful ideas, but he did not have a grasp of details. He always saw the potential, never the risks of things. And I say with this page compositor, he put something like, in contemporary dollars, about $9 million into it. Not only blew his own fortune, but his wife's. And he would write these things in terms of the competition. Our competitors' machines are going straight to the junk shop, ours can't fail. It was only his mother out in the Midwest, Jane Lambton Clemens, who asked him, what happens if the machine fails? She was the only one who realized that everything might not be quite as, certain as her son was making out. She unfortunately turned out to be prophetic about that.
Moving in a kind of a different direction, I think one of the things that I am a reader or an American or a student who, like, when I think of Mark Twain, I think about Tom Sawyer and I think about Huckleberry Finn and I think about the Civil War. What was really interesting to me reading about Mark Twain's adolescence and kind of young adulthood was that he's coming of age during the Civil War, but based on kind of the writing that you have in the book and sort of how you're talking about it, it didn't really seem like he paid too much attention to the Civil War, despite living in Missouri and kind of this in between, but like the North and the South. He definitely identified more as a Southerner and was kind of anti-Union. But
he was very, very conflicted.
Yeah.
About it, because he came from a Southern background. He was from Hannibal, Missouri, which is located up in the upper northeast corner of Missouri, rural area, directly on the Mississippi. It had been settled by a lot of people in the South, who brought their slaves. So it definitely has a Southern orientation to it. On the other hand, in the lead up to the Civil War, Twain is quite violently opposed to secession, which does not mean that he was opposed to slavery. He certainly was later on, but at that point he wasn't. So he joins a Confederate militia for a couple of weeks, but he's very conflicted about the whole thing. But then his brother Orion gets an appointment as Secretary of the Nevada Territory. And this springs Twain from his conflict over the Civil War, because suddenly he and Orion are in this stagecoach that travels for 18 days out to the Nevada Territory. And among other things, you really feel that he is escaping the Civil War, and he's escaping a reckoning with the Civil War. And he wouldn't really write about his experiences in the Civil War until about 20 years afterwards. And then he kind of played it for laughs, frankly, without really grappling with what had happened. So there was clearly, a big unresolved conflict there about the war. But he's lucky. He goes out to the Nevada Territory. So first in the late 1850s, he's working as a steamboat pilot. And to work on the steamboat at that time meant that, every conceivable type of human being, would pass through your ship. So he had an exposure to all sorts of different types of people out in the heartland. And then he goes out to the Nevada Territory. Again, people have flocked there from all over the country. It was the time of the Comstock lode, the greatest silver mining lode in American history. And there's people from all over the country, all over the world. So he keeps getting into one situation after another where he has exposure to a tremendous variety of people, to a tremendous variety of different dialects. And he was very, very observant. And he's constantly storing up, material without realizing that he's storing up material for future use. Although it took time before he went back to his boyhood experiences with Tom Sawyer and Huck Finn. It seems obvious now to us that he would end up writing fiction about that. But strangely enough, it didn't seem obvious to him till around the time he was in his early 30s that suddenly the past, his boyhood, his adolescence come rushing up from the deep, and he's very, thrilled and haunted and fascinated by the memories of all the people he had known and all the adventures that he had had in and around Hannibal.
One of the things I had to keep reminding myself while reading the book was thinking about how the technology that we maybe take for granted now is not something that was even available in his lifetime. And when we're talking about him traveling from Missouri to Nevada, like you were saying, it's an 18-day ride in a stagecoach rather than a flight now, like that would take a few hours. And I was wondering, like, do you think because he was traveling so prolifically and across the country, like in a way that I can't imagine a lot of people were doing at the time, because he goes from Missouri to Nevada, then I think he spends time in San Francisco,
That's right.
for a little bit, and then he
goes to the Sandwich Islands.
Yep, and then he goes to New York at some point, and so
New York and Philly and DC. Yeah, he has this wanderlust. He's extremely restless. There's a letter where he says, "I have to move!" Exclamation point. There's like an inner turmoil that prompts him to keep moving on. And it's interesting because Mark Twain is the quintessential American. He actually wrote in his notebook once, he said, "I'm not an American, I am the American," which sounds kind of arrogant, but maybe it was true. But the interesting thing is, here is this quintessential American character who dies at 74, but of those 74 years, he spent 11 years outside of the United States. So he was extremely well traveled, lived for extended periods, for instance, in London, Paris, Vienna, Berlin. So this guy from the heartland becomes our most cosmopolitan and worldly American author. We tend not to think about him that way. Finally, what happens, he's forced into a 9-year exile because he has squandered his fortune and his wife Libby's fortune. So he's forced into 9 years of exile in Europe. He claims to economize, although they're living in magnificent villas in Italy or palatial suites, hotel suites in Vienna. It's not quite clear how they're saving any money. But he gradually loses his desire for travel, and then towards the end, he said, "I have wearied of travel." He said, "I've seen every country except for two, heaven and hell." And he said, "And I only have a vague curiosity about one of those two." So at that point, he just sort of wants to be home after years of really wandering in exile. In order to pay off his debts, he had to do this round the world tour and talk about, different technologies. To do a round the world tour was all done by sea. Mm-hmm. He went across North America down to Hawaii. Then there was, Australia, New Zealand, Sri Lanka, and India, then ended up in South Africa. These were really vast distances at the time to cover. And yet, amazingly enough, wherever he goes around the world, literally, he's a celebrity, which is saying something, because, again, this is sort of not only pre-internet, it's pre-television, pre-radio, but somehow his image and his persona and his books were known everywhere.
Yeah, and thinking about the worldwide tour, because I do remember I think maybe it was like 10 or so years ago, there was a book, I forget the author's name, but I think it was called Chasing the Last Laugh.
That's right. That's right. It's a good book. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And basically it's a real zoomed in approach to that tour, and kind of saying how it's like the first ever stand-up comedy tour, like worldwide global thing, but it did take years because he's traveling by boat to all of these exotic locations, and it's just such a crazy adventure. But with that, your point about him being kind of the most famous American, like, is there a case to be made that Mark Twain is sort of the earliest instance of like American monoculture being exported globally in a way that would become much more common?
Yeah, I just did a piece for the Wall Street Journal about Mark Twain as the original celebrity. Mm-hmm. And what I argued was that he was really the first to master what was a modern media landscape. That is, we had the rise of mass circulation newspapers, rise of mass circulation, magazines. And he knew how to project an image. I mean, this was not accidental, the business with the white suit. He was asked by the reporters what the white suit represented. And he said, it represents the American Association of Purity and Perfection, of which I am president and sole member. He also had a very funny line. He said that most men wear suits that are dark and accumulate so much dirt that you could plant seeds in them and raise a crop. So he's a master showman. He would do interviews in bed. The reporters would gather around the bed. He would do interviews in bed, smoking cigars, propped up in pillows, and he would be in his nightshirt. And when a reporter once complained to his wife, Livy, about Twain doing the interview in bed, Twain said, well, if you prefer, you can make up the bed next to me. You can interview me, from that bed, if he would feel more comfortable, that way. But he's like the first of a type that would become familiar in the 20th and early 21st century of the all-purpose pundit, the go-to person. If reporters need a quote about anything happening under the sun, there was Twain. I came of age in the 60s. I remember we had turn on late night television. There would be Norman Mailer or Truman Capote or Gore Vidal, and they would be spouting off on almost anything that had happened, in the news that day. And it's a type that has only become more familiar. And of course, now we have all these late night comedians who do that. But in Mark Twain's, he was really the first person to stake out that territory as the pundit. And amazingly enough, I mean, his daughter Clara said, I was always amazed that my father seemed to have an opinion on every person, situation, disease under the sun. And he did. It was partly that he was extremely erudite, knowledgeable about very wide range. I mean, he was more likely to be reading a book of astronomy or geology or theology than a novel. So he had an extraordinary range of knowledge, and it all came into play.
Do you have a sense of, if Mark Twain were alive today, what he would be using, like in terms of media platforms? Do you think he'd want to be on TV? Do you think he'd have a podcast? Like, do you have an idea of what a 21st century Mark Twain would look like?
Probably all of the above. It would probably replace me, replace you, replace Mark Twain loved attention. From the time that he was a boy, he said, his ambition was notice and notoriety. Late in life, he said, of his boyhood, he said, celebrity is what a boy craves and desires more than anything else. He said, the boy would be a pirate. The boy would be a clown. The boy would sell himself to Satan if only he could be envied and attract attention. And so from the time that he's a boy, he wants to attract people's attention. And so he would not have been shy about doing a podcast or being on late night television, because in his day, to a remarkable extent, he was ubiquitous in that way. And he was a master at controlling his image in the media, not always. And sometimes he had rather severe clashes with the reporters. But, he was so famous even in his lifetime that fairly early on in his career, there were Mark Twain impersonators appearing in different countries. He was so famous that you could write to him from anywhere in the world, and the letter would reach him. His wife used to keep a special file of this. They got one letter that was addressed to Mark Twain somewhere, and another letter reached him that was addressed to Mark Twain anywhere, maybe with Satan. And these letters would show up on his doorstep. So that's something that obviously attests to just how well known he was. So he would, I think he would, in many ways, love this media landscape because there would be so many opportunities to present himself out there. He was not a shrinking violet.
Do you get a sense that he, despite being a political pundit to some extent and always commenting on that, did he ever have like any political aspirations of his own, or did he always stay away from it?
No, he would joke with the reporters. I remember in 1900, he joked with the reporters that he was thinking of running for president. There was one campaign that he became very involved in. It was when Seth Low, who was the president of Columbia University, ran for mayor of New York. And Mark Twain, actively went out and campaigned and made speeches. And then, they felt that they had swept away the crooks from Tammany Hall. And Mark Twain appeared at this celebration where they were all carrying brooms designed to signify, that they had swept out the crooked politicians. He was active in a lot of different political causes, but often for kind of a brief period. It would not be a sustained commitment. And very often he would say that he would lend his name as long as he didn't have to do anything else. But when he got involved, it was memorable and he was fearless. I'll just give one example. In the early 1900s, when the United States occupied the Philippines, Mark Twain felt originally that we had gone to the Philippines in order to liberate the Philippines. Then he saw that instead we had gone into the Philippines to conquer the Philippines. And so he got up at a banquet where he was the Toastmaster. And he said, that our soldiers are carrying disgraced muskets and marching under a polluted flag. Well, there were gasps in the room. People were horrified. Very, very difficult in the middle of a war to have the nerve, the courage in order to defy it. So he was willing to take quite a lot of heat, which is interesting because early in his career, he was always afraid that if he was too candid on his political opinions, that he would lose his readership, because he starts out as this beloved humorist, was very proud that he had kind of this national following, and was afraid of losing that if people knew more about his real feelings under the surface. But then as time went on, well, he called his white suits his "my don't care a damn suit." That kind of says it all. He just sort of reached an age and a point in life where, I guess because he was very well established, most of his books were already published, and he just let her rip at that point.
So he kind of used because I think that's something that I imagine a lot of, or what I hear, certain comedians or performers, writers, anyone who has a job that's engaging with entertainment or communication or literature or anything like that. I feel like sometimes there's a pressure sometimes, I think, especially in the polarized times that we're in right now, where people are kind of like, shut up, I don't want to hear your politics. I just want to hear your greatest hits from 20 years ago or something. And so was there ever any kind of backlash that he received when he started getting a little bit more political?
It's a very good point that you make, because after he not only criticized U.S. occupation of the Philippines, also criticized the role of Christian missionaries in China at the time of the Boxer Rebellion. And there's a good book of letters that people wrote to Mark Twain. And, they wrote to him with a real feeling of sadness and betrayal. "I always loved your writing," and that they would say that always found him funny, and heartwarming, and that he was, unrecognizable to them now. So that was hard for him. I think, hard for any author, frankly, to lose this. I published my first book in, 1990. That was The Morgan. And I have been very proud of the following, of the readership, that I've developed, and I really treasure and value all those people who've been, reading me from the beginning. And I can easily imagine how painful it would be to do things that are, so displeasing to these people that they just stop reading you.
I think also something I was curious to kind of talk to you about was, although Mark Twain does have a lot of principles and values that I think are, we're talking about as pretty commendable and progressive, there are certainly aspects of his personality, his life, that are vaguely or sometimes just outright problematic by modern standards, which you, I think in the opening to the book, in the prologue, you kind of just outright say that and say like, hey, he had a lot of problematic things, specifically with his journey with racism, and then also some of his, I don't necessarily know how to frame it, his relationships with younger women, not super great right now. But as a historian and someone who's writing about these different figures who are lauded and famous, but also came from a different time with different norms and values, like how do you navigate that moral ambiguity, and that when you're writing about these figures where you're kind of celebrating them, but you're making a point to call out certain things and say, we're not celebrating this, but we're acknowledging it, that it was part of him?
Yeah, absolutely. Chris, all the people that I have written about, I have admired, to one degree or another. And I have always felt that if I do a book that on balance is admiring, I go out of my way to present all the flaws in that personality, because, the last thing I want is for someone to say, oh, sure, Chernow admired Alexander Hamilton, but he didn't mention A, B, C, and D. Well, I go out of my way to mention A, B, C, and D, because I feel strongly that great figures can carry the weight of their own flaws. And we're all very flawed. And I think that anyone like me who does biography as a business, it's an enterprise that only reinforces this idea that we're all very mixed human beings. There are no saints or angels among us. In terms of the racism issue, it's kind of a big part of the book. I really tried to show his development, because he's born into a slave-owning family in a slave-owning state. In his early years, he has a lot of the racism that one would imagine someone, from that background would have. But then he travels an absolutely inconceivable distance over the course of his life in terms of his enlightenment and his tolerance. Does he ever become, just a kind of paragon perfection? No, but I tried with these controversial subjects to deal with them as honestly and fully as I can. And if the person deserves censure, I censure them. If the person deserves praise, I do. And very often it's just kind of a mixed picture. I think that, the writing of history is not writing the stories of saints and sinners. And I always tell, students who want to be biographers, if you go into a book really admiring the person, you're going to be shocked by some awful things that they've done. And if you go into a biography intending to quote unquote get the person, you may well find redeeming features that will be no less surprising to you. This is like, biographer is like a second story, man. You're climbing into someone's house in the middle of the night, and you start rummaging through the drawers, and you will undoubtedly find things that start to shock and surprise you. For me, this is one of the great delights of doing it, and something that I love, sharing with the reader of these discoveries. But when you start doing a book, no matter how much you think you know about the person, it's maybe 5 or 10% of what you end up knowing when you really have devoted, entire years to studying them.
And then when you do get that full picture, it turns out it's this kind of checkered mosaic of not all good things and not all bad things. It's just a very uniquely human kind of, like you said earlier, like a mixed bag. Everyone is just a mixed bag of things that are commendable, and then also kind of...
Yeah, and I think actually in the case of Mark Twain, it makes the story much more fascinating. That he was so full of contradictions. I mean, here's this man who, on the one hand, is constantly railing against the plutocrats in his writing, and then as soon as he puts down his pen, he rushes out and he's doing everything he can in his business life to join them. This is kind of what makes the fascination of the personality, that the pieces don't easily add up together. But that's true of most of us. And I think that when people read a biography, they know, because they feel it in themselves, they see it in their friends and family, that people are strange amalgams of good and evil. And if the biography is honest, you're going to get to know all sides of this person.
I think, too, that maybe it's making me think about how Mark Twain, we're talking about him being the quintessential kind of American literary icon, but it almost seems to me to be a quintessential American literary icon, you need to have those contradictions, because in my mind, the American identity can be summed up in the word contradiction. Like, it is, that is what America is, it's contradiction. And so our author, our founding literary father, needs to be as contradictory as our country itself.
Absolutely, Chris. That's why when Mark Twain, as I said, wrote in his notebook, I'm not an American, I'm the American. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons he is the American, to my mind, is that he compresses in this one life. All the good and all the bad of the culture is inside this man, which is why he was able to recreate this brilliant, array of characters in his fiction. He was once asked why he didn't read more in psychology and philosophy in terms of studying human nature. And he made the comment, he said, I have all of human nature inside myself. I just have to study myself. And very often his self-appraisals were very harsh. After his beloved eldest daughter, Susie, died, she died at 24 of bacterial meningitis. And he felt he'd been, and he wrote, I neglected her. I neglected her like I did everyone in my selfishness. Terrible thing to have to write. He also, I quote him in the book, as saying that he felt that Lord Byron hated the human race because he hated himself. And Mark Twain then writes, I feel the same way about myself. So this is a man who, for someone who has, created so much laughter in the world, there are so many dark sides, not just to his personality, but unfortunately, particularly in his family life, where he just suffered one calamity after another.
Which I think is true for most comedians. I think, not most, but many comedians, they have that darkness within them that they learn to either cope with by seeking laughter or using humor as a way of coping it. But it's like you almost need that inherent sadness or darkness to be able to achieve what he did achieve.
No, absolutely. And I found as I worked on the book that in a certain way, even though he's such a unique figure, he does fit a certain stereotype of the funny man who's, sad underneath, who's crying underneath, that there was a depressive quality. There was, modern terms, a kind of, manic depressive quality. He himself noted that his emotions were volcanic or titanic. He would use different words. And he would say, my emotions veer from one extreme to another. And I think the humor was, in one way, of his dealing with all of this, darkness in his life. Interestingly, people who recorded meeting him, very often people would spend the evening with him and said that, he didn't laugh or smile the entire time. Kind of one imagines being with Mark Twain, that he would just be sitting there, saying one funny thing after another. Not necessarily the case. And in fact, I have a charming story in the book. One day, his youngest daughter, Jean, he wanted to read to her something from one of her books because she had been sick. And so she found him reading, I think it was Huck Finn, but I'm not sure. It was one of his books. And he was laughing out loud. And she chided him. She said, Father, how can you do that? She said, and he said, Jean, it's so damn funny, I can't help myself. She said, yeah, but Father, you wrote it. She felt that there was something vain and unseemly about Mark Twain sitting there, laughing at his own humor. But the story is interesting because that happens so seldom. Occasionally he would go back and read something that he had written and found it very funny. But by and large, he did not. And I also have stories in the book that, because he spent some of his life on the lecture circuit, that after one of his most brilliant lectures, he was going back to the hotel with a friend, and he had been particularly scintillating on the stage that night, but he was in a foul mood afterwards, and the friend commented his surprise that Mark Twain was so depressed after having this great evening on the stage. And, he said something like, I just gave them nonsense. I just made them laugh. There wasn't any substance to it. And he felt, there was one side of him who felt almost embarrassed by his status as a humorist, that he wanted to also be an educator. Interestingly, in his early life, he did consider becoming a preacher. I mean, there was a kind of moralistic and moralizing side to his nature, but very often he felt if he had simply made people laugh and not made them think, that he had failed.
So he's holding himself to a very high standard, and also kind of deeply attuned to, or maybe not attuned, but experiencing his emotions, and kind of more, would you say that he was more introverted than what we traditionally think of as an extrovert, kind of? Was he an introvert learned how to, or was definitely extroverted?
No, he was actually quite extroverted. In fact, he had a real terror of solitude. So he was constantly surrounded by people. During one period, for instance, when he's living in New York, he seems to be the host and the toastmaster for every banquet in town. He loved the attention. He loved being surrounded by people. I think what I was trying to say was that it wasn't a merry personality in the way that we might imagine. There was more underlying seriousness to his personality, but he loved being surrounded by people, and God knows if he wanted to make them laugh, he could. He actually said it was something. He was everyone's favorite toastmaster at every banquet and gala, and he said it was actually something of a problem that after a certain point he would get up there, and he said people would be on the verge of laughter before he'd even opened his mouth. They kind of came prepared to be entertained by them, which of course they would be. But he felt it was almost unearned that they were already laughing, when they walked into the room, because they knew they were going to hear Mark Twain. And he also, I was interested to discover that there were 2-3 times in his life that he said that he regretted not having had 2 pen names, that he should have had one pen name for his humorous pieces and another pen name for his more serious pieces, because he was always afraid, because the early books, were so funny, and then sort of dealing more, prose, political polemics, different things. He was always afraid, referring to what we were talking about before, that someone would pick up one of his books. He knew him as Mark Twain, the humorist, and suddenly is getting this book that maybe has very little or no humor, and would feel cheated by it. So that might have been something interesting for him to do. But Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, I guess, this is kind of as much as we could handle. Imagine if we had to handle a third name in this conversation, it would drive us crazy.
That's fascinating that the very pseudonym that he used as kind of the vehicle of his unprecedented celebrity, eventually, to some extent, kind of becomes a restriction for him, and that he's bogged down by this name and this identity of having to be Mark Twain, even though he's not Mark Twain. That's so fascinating.
Yeah, and there were a couple of cases with his books where he wanted the publisher to withhold his name from the title page. It just happened, most people don't know, he wrote a book called The Personal Recollections of Joan of Arc. He had this lifelong Joan of Arc obsession. And so he felt that the book would not get serious attention if his name was on it, because people would assume it would be a funny book, which it was not. But people pretty quickly guessed who the author was. It was very hard for him to maintain his anonymity, but he did feel that tension, particularly since the earlier books are, humorous. Many of them are fiction. The later books tend not only to be nonfiction, but often kind of, political and dogmatic. He does a takedown of Mary Baker Eddy. He does an entire book that Shakespeare didn't write Shakespeare's plays. He was a man of very strong opinions, and he wanted to express them. And those later books did not, needless to say, do as well. But he was adamant that Francis Bacon and not Shakespeare had written the plays by William Shakespeare. One of my favorite stories was he went to the theater one night to see Romeo and Juliet, and he stood up at the end and said to his companion, "That was the best thing Bacon ever wrote."
Well, Ron, you've been really generous with your time, and I know we have to wrap things up soon. I just had a couple more questions for you. Sure. To touch back on something that you'd mentioned before, where you're working with the biographers of tomorrow and you're teaching them, the art of biography, specifically how, you as one of the most lauded, famous biographers of our time, how do you think, because something that I kept reflecting on while I was reading the book was that, do you think the biographers of the future are going to have a hard time writing biographies because we've moved so far away from written correspondence, that we're so digital now that all of our records and correspondence that you used, I know you used a lot of materials to research this book, but is there something lost, or will biographies be different in the future?
It's a very good question. In fact, this is a question that's debated all the time by biographers and historians, because, one of the great pleasures of my career has been immersing myself in the correspondence of all the different people that I've written about, and also because letter writing was such a large part of life that even people who were not highly educated had a distinctive letter writing style. They wrote with a kind of ease that people can't now. So in terms of what record people would leave now, it may be that it will seem impoverished compared to, the figures of the past. As I said, with Mark Twain, we have thousands and thousands of letters that he wrote. On the other hand, with email and text messages and everything, we are, maybe to an unusual degree, leaving a verbal trail, every day throughout the day, if those things are in a form that could later be retrieved. So it's a little bit difficult to say, but in general, I would say that your concern is well warranted. And so I like the fact that the figures that I've done, 18th, 19th, early 20th century figures, I know that there's going to be a very, very rich treasure trove of letters and diaries to go through. So I do worry about future biographies looking back at our time, and that the resources will seem rather limited.
And the irony being that we have more digital communication than any other point in human history. But although I'm not writing letters, texting all the time, that if my texts were made available to a future biographer, that's, would be probably so much material to work with. All of our text messages or
that's it could be even more abundant. I should also say that, aside from the written record, it's very frustrating when you're doing Mark Twain. We have one short, it's like a minute and a half clip that the Edison people did this tiny film of Mark Twain up in Redding, Connecticut, which is where his final home was. And you see him walking along the footpath, and then he sits and he's having tea with his two daughters. That's it. We don't, and it's terribly frustrating. We don't have an authentic recording of his voice. He had been a mentor to a famous actor named William Gillette, who became famous for, I think, doing Sherlock Holmes. And you can go on the internet, because Gillette grew up in Hartford, had known the Clemenses from the time that he was a boy. So you can go on the internet and you can find William Gillette mimicking Mark Twain. And since Gillette was supposedly a very, very good mimic, it probably is pretty close. But given the fact that Mark Twain was so famous for his voice, and this voice that millions upon millions of people, heard him on the lecture stage, it's very frustrating that we don't have a single, even 10-second clip. In fact, he did experiment at various times with dictating his writings. There were these recording cylinders that the Edison company had. but he found it was not to his liking, and no one has ever been able to track those down. That would be a great find if someone could. So, something's lost, something's gained, because certainly anyone writing about contemporary figures, well, I've just been sitting here, you've just been sitting here for, an hour. Well, that's kind of gives a lot of us in terms of how we sound and what our facial expressions are like and how we, express ourselves and everything else. And so that's something that, gee, if I could have had that with George Washington or John D. Rockefeller, wouldn't that have been, a nice thing to have?
It is fascinating. I guess the resources that are made available to you kind of dictate how much creativity you have, and you can't necessarily we don't have any control over the resources of our time or what kind of records or documents we're leaving behind of ourselves. So that's really fascinating. I think I was curious to hear also before we go, are there any writers or comedians in mind who are working today who you think are either particularly Twainian in their approach, or that Mark Twain would be like, I like that guy, I think he's doing it right, or woman, or person?
I like a lot of our late night comedians, so I kind of hate to single one out, lest it sound like criticism of the other. But one person who does a little bit remind me of Mark Twain is Bill Maher. And I'll tell you why. It's not only that he has a very kind of dry, sharp sense of humor, but you sense that there's an underlying intelligence and there's an iconoclasm, that you don't know what's going to come out of his mouth. He's not afraid to shock opinion. He's very, very independent in that way. And so, Colbert and Conan Bryan, there are just a lot of, wonderful personalities out there. I think that with Mark Twain, it was more than just the kind of witticisms. It was that people felt the underlying intelligence, and that they felt that there was a political and a philosophical system under what he was saying. And I think that is what has given it lasting volumes. I'll just tell you one last interesting story. At one point in his later years, someone gave Mark Twain an anthology of American humorists. And I think there were about 40 or 50 American humorists in there. And he was one of them, and he leafed through it. And he was struck by the fact that of those 40 or 50 American humorists, he was the only one who was still known. A lot of them had been big names in their time. Artemus Ward, Petroleum V. Nasby, all these different 19th century. They'd been big people in their times, but they were forgotten. And so he asked himself, why they had faded, and he had continued. And he said because their humor was topical. It was based on something, of kind of passing interest that they were speaking to. Whereas somehow Mark Twain, I was telling you the story about seeing him, Hal Holbrook doing Mark Twain Tonight back in 1975. And what struck me was that these witticisms about American politics and society still seemed as fresh and valid a century later as they did at the time. So that's kind of the standard that I would wonder. You could sit there roaring your head off watching Saturday Night Live, let's say, but to what extent does the humor stand up? Because it's reacting to the week's events, whereas Mark Twain somehow managed to produce humor that transcended the merely topical, and it's very difficult to do.
And I think just as Mark Twain's humor and work is timeless, I think so is the new biography that you've given us. I think this is going to, as if Mark Twain was not immortal enough already, I think this adds to that legacy, and it adds to your legacy. And it's such an exciting book. So I'm sure it's going to do great this spring. Listeners, if you're listening at home, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Mark Twain at your local Barnes & Noble store or at bn.com. If you love Ron's other books, I'm sure you're not going to miss this one. If you enjoyed this conversation, this was literally just the tip of the iceberg. And I think we've covered so many different anecdotes and facets of Mark Twain's personality, but it's really just the beginning. So I think readers are really going to appreciate it. Ron, I would love to speak with you for many more hours about Mark Twain and history and all of this. This has been great. Thank you so much for being here.
It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for having me, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Hello, readers. It's time for another TBR Top Off. We're going to recommend a couple of wonderful books to pick up when you stop in for your copy of Mark Twain by Ron Chernow. I'm Mark at my Barnes & Noble in Cincinnati, but I'm going to have my book buddy Donald kick things off from Detroit. Donald, how are you? What do you got for us?
So, hi, Mark. So for Ron Chernow's newest book, Twain, which is about 10 years in the making, I have two small recommendations this time. And I say small, but really one is huge. So the first one is Ron Chernow's Grant. One thing that I learned in reading both books is that they both knew each other, and they both were friends, and they experienced in very different ways a lot of what was going on in that time frame. So the first one I wanted to throw out there was, of course, Ron Chernow's Grant, which, again, is about the President Ulysses S. Grant. But the main focus that I wanted to talk about is James by Percival Everett. He went on to win the National Book Award for this book. It was a Barnes & Noble Book of the Year winner. Plus was nominated for every other award under the sun and won some other awards as well. And it's well-deserved about this book. You're like, oh, well, what more can I learn about, Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer and all the experiences that they both had? If you have not already read this book, please, 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 you're going to want to pick this up. The way James tells this story and the way Percival Everett puts James on the page is one of the most original and exciting ways to tell a character story. The language that he creates and how he talks to other fellow slaves, as opposed to how he talks with Tom and Huck. I didn't even know that. I didn't even know that after reading all those books ages ago, that there was literally a different way that they spoke in their language to appear smarter or less intelligent. It just depended on, what needed to get them through. So I could spend hours talking about this book. You just want to go out there, pick that book up. But again, that was James by Percival Everett. Again, won all the awards. You got to go and pick it up.
So, yes, I have to applaud that. James is brilliant. Anything that Ron Chernow has done, but I like the idea of a companion as James is a read with Mark Twain. I think it could give some really beautiful context to Chernow's newest book. I think that Chernow is somebody who is so rock solid in his biographies. The amount of time he puts in, the work he puts in, and the finished product is always such a slam dunk every single time. It made me try to plumb the depths of my memory for just the right biography that could kind of work really nicely, but I ultimately just went with something that I think more people should be reading, and that is Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World by Andrea Wolf. This book is so engaging and fascinating and so well written and researched, and it places a spotlight on someone who desperately deserves a reclamation of a very large and tall pedestal. Alexander von Humboldt was an explorer, a scientist, an environmentalist, a philosopher, and kind of a rock star in the social and science circles. Folks like Darwin and writers like Thoreau, John Muir, Jules Verne, so many people were inspired by Humboldt's writing and philosophies, and a lot of their work was heavily influenced by Humboldt. Yet a lot of people don't know who this guy is. And this book really helps change that and bring him back into the forefront in the way that he deserves. I think that he brought so many nature concepts to the world that brought in over 200 years ago and are still applicable today. The way that he changed the way that science and art can be married, the way that he looked at the earth as an organism that all moving parts needed to be participating in. The way that he infused philosophy and forward thought into the hard sciences was just really, really incredible. And the fact that all of his applications are still something just as important today is just a testament to what he has affected. But also, this book is incredibly entertaining. The circles that he moved in were really interesting, and the impact that he made on his own society was very, very inspirational. And I think it's something that can be really looked at now and appreciated and celebrated. It's just a really, really strong biography, and I want Humboldt to be as well known as Mark Twain or Roosevelt or really anybody. He is an icon and should be cheered in the streets all the time. So start by reading Invention of Nature by Andrea Wolf. It is fantastic. But guess what, everybody? That's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for tuning in to Poured Over. Please make sure to give us a rating and subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. You can also follow us on our socials at Barnes & Noble. My name is Mark. You can follow my home store at BN Westchester. Donald, where can we find you?
I am now in a new location, so you can follow me at BN Livonia.
All right, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Happy reading. Bye.
Thank you for listening. Poured Over is a Barnes & Noble production. To help other readers find us, please rate and review the show wherever you listen to podcasts.